And if you don't mind, please share the live broadcast on your Facebook. That will be helpful so that more people can join us in the conversation. So it looks like we are live. So if you don't mind, go ahead and share our post. I did tag a few of you. Okay, just sharing onto the Amana page before we start. Okay, so now that we have the sharing all done, we can go ahead and, yes, Cameron, I am streaming through Facebook. I went ahead and streamed from my Latoya page, and then I also shared that to the Amana page and to the dance company's page. So if you can share from either one of those venues, that will be great. And I am going to make sure that I can see it on the page so that if any of you from Facebook have questions or comments, please do add to the conversation. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. So there's a lot to discuss when you want to discuss things like prophets or people or offices or gifts like prophets. And most people, when they tackle this area, they tackle it from the standpoint of the church. And then they bring in all of these categories and different types of prophets that kind of muddy the waters. And in my opinion, creates a hierarchy that's actually quite volatile and detrimental to the growth of the church. So a lot of what I want to do here is I want to help you situate the prophets in their role as the Bible presents them. So we're going to really discuss prophets from the standpoint of the Hebrew Bible, because it's where a lot of these sources come from. A lot of people really don't touch the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, but you can't learn about prophets effectively if you're not reading those books. So we'll think about what prophets are, what they do, how they operate, and then we'll go into some ways in which the Bible thinks through different types of prophets. And really, from a macro level, we're talking about institutions in this case. That will lead us into discussing prophets more broadly, thinking through the office as something that can be represented in various institutions. And we're going to move on to spheres of influence to help you figure out where you fit in that, because I strongly believe that we are all in so many ways called to operate and act as prophets in various arenas, but it really just depends on your sphere of influence, and determining that becomes really important. So I've drafted that in this agenda here. We're going to talk about defining prophets, and we're going to move on to types of biblical prophets, the office itself, and then some spheres of influence. And lastly, I will conclude by letting you know what we're doing here at Amana Bible Institute. We're doing a whole lot of stuff. We're going to continue offering for you guys some free webinars so that you get an idea of who we are, you get an idea as to how we teach and what we're interested in. We're not just interested in being smuggy scholars of the Bible who are fairly legalistic and traditional. We want to break the mold, speak of the Bible in as it is in its context, but think about it in more universal ways. And we want to engage in dialogue that's going to help us to live the text. So one of the things that I'm thinking about, and you guys can let me know in the comments if this is something that you would like, but maybe having our July webinars focus on how the Bible can, in so many ways, help us in times of conflict, like in this time where there's quite a bit of racial injustice. It's being acknowledged. It's always been there, but we're getting a lot more protests and riots and activity nowadays that is definitely showing us that this issue is quite large and has not been remedied. But the Bible speaks to a lot of this stuff in who humans are and how humans are meant to act and relate to their environment, and relate to one another. And so I think the Bible can also definitely be used to shed some light on some of these racial concerns that we're having, and also gender biases in sexuality, biases in socioeconomic status. So maybe we can spend the month of July thinking through those things and allowing the Bible to illuminate us and shed light on how we can move forward. So if you're interested in that, let me know in some comments or send me an email. I definitely want to hear your voice, and I want to make sure that we are offering things here at Amana that's actually interesting to you, and in addition is actually doing something to shake the world. So there's that. So now I want to go ahead and define prophets for you guys. And my PowerPoint is doing some really weird things when it's in the show. So I'm going to pull it out of the show so that you guys can actually see the words, because for some reason it's blacked out. But if it's too small, just let me know. So when we're talking about prophets, there are typically 4 terms in the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that really defines or acknowledges this nominal form of this act of prophecy. There's nabi, which is in the Hebrew, comes from the verb nabah or navah. That B and V is interchangeable with the Hebrew bait. And it's really just the person who prophesies, who's a spokesman, who's a herald in so many ways. Then there's the term chozeh, which comes from the Hebrew chazah, which is interesting. It means to see or to stargaze. So I want to give you some examples as to how this is used in Amos chapter 7, and we're going to be in Amos quite a bit today, actually. So if you want to go there and just stick your finger there, that will be great. In Amos chapter 7, around verse 12, you get this interesting narrative that interrupts Amos's prophecies. And really he's having multiple visions, and these are the visions that are discussed here in chapter 7. But there's a little narrative that interrupts his vision when he runs into Amaziah, a priest of the land. And Amaziah says in verse 12 to Amos, "O seer, go flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there, and prophesy there." So we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but really prophets, the occupation of a prophet, it was just as much of an occupation as it is today in being a doctor or lawyer or teacher. There were schools to educate prophets in the ancient world, and it was a legit role. And Amaziah is pretty much saying to Amos, go make your money where you live. Go prophesy there. But the term that he's using to identify who Amos is or what Amos is living into is the term translated in these Bibles as seer, and it is this chozeh term, to see or to stargaze. This term is also used in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 13, and really it's just used there to represent the act the actions of the astrologers. So there's a connection between the astrologers, who are denounced in the text, to be honest, and their ability to sight see or to stargaze. They're looking at the stars and literally using that to provide omens, and in so many ways living into some kind of prophetic office through stargazing. Lastly, in the Hebrew Bible, we get ro'eh, which is the term that comes from the Hebrew verb ra'ah, meaning to see. But ra'ah is really interesting because it just doesn't mean to see with your eyes. It also means to see with your heart, see with your mind. It's the perceiving word, to consider, to inspect, to observe. So ro'ahs are really just individuals who are actually acting in the role of people who are perceiving the world around them, inspecting the world around them, considering the world around them, and seeing, in that case, understanding the world around them. All of those meanings are connected to this term ro'eh. And by the way, you'll know this if you take Hebrew with me. We're going to try to offer a language course for you guys here in the fall. For those of you interested in learning biblical Hebrew or New Testament Greek, choseh and ro'eh are just active verbal forms of the more finite verb that it comes from. So in this case, they're participles describing the person who is acting, right? So the choseh is the man or the person who is seeing or gazing. Ro'eh is the person who is seeing or perceiving or inspecting. So it's definitely a more active and ongoing uh, uh, form of speech. And that's really important because the role of the prophet is not something that is finite in so many ways. It's not something that is static, but it's something that is dynamic. And that's really important. Lastly, we have the word prophetes from the Greek, meaning prophet or spokesman, also meaning something like herald. And this is really an interesting term because there are many prophetes or prophet tie in the plural in the ancient world. And these aren't all just people who are prophetically releasing something from a religious standpoint. They're also just heralds, people who make grand pronouncements. You know, the herald of the king can be acting as a prophetess. So the word in itself, it breaks down into two Greek words, pra, meaning before, and phemi, which is a verb meaning I say. That's the literal translation of phemi. So it's really just a person who is speaking forth or speaking before, right? So to speak before others in so many ways. So these terms, if we really think about what's happening here, and if we also think about how the noun is created here in the Hebrew and Greek, we kind of really get an idea as to the dynamic activity of people who fit these terms themselves. So biblical prophets are they're mouthpieces of God. This is really clear. This is one of the things that we hear all the time. What we hear less of, though, is how intermediary or how liminal these prophets are. Prophets are meant to work and to live in and on boundaries. So in this case, they kind of live in between multiple worlds, you know? They are counselors in that case and wise men, right? We have Daniel in the book of Daniel, who is acting and living into some kind of prophetic office, but he is also counselor and a wise man to the king. The same for Joseph in the book of Genesis. They are intercessors and expounders of the law. So Deborah in the book of Judges, the only female judge, is known to be a prophet. She's a female prophetess or a female prophet. Most of us consider those, we call them prophetesses. And ultimately, she is the only judge who is tied to this interpretation and expounding of the law. She is discussed in Judges as this person who sits under a tree and she teaches the people about the law. She resolves their concerns, and she is tied to her ability to interpret the law well and to help people to live into it. The only judge who's known to do that, and she's also the only female judge, so she's pretty amazing in the text. Nonetheless, it seems to be a part of her prophetic activity that allows her to do that. We mentioned this in the webinar on the relevance of biblical prophecy, which was earlier in the month. And we mentioned how in times of conflict, prophets do a ton of things that are really important, things that are even the more important in this current climate, in this time, in the states and outside of the United States. But prophets are meant to provide a rationale for the hardship. They are meant to restore and reinforce identity during these times of hardships. And in this case, they are also meant to help people to properly respond to conflict. And so we definitely need to see a lot more of that action occurring in our own climate. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns as we before we move on? I see a few people watching on Facebook. Please do make comments, ask questions. And there's a few of you who are here in Zoom. Feel free to unmute your mics and interject whenever. So I'll go ahead and move on as while we're waiting for any type of comments. But there are in the Bible two groups, larger groups of prophets. There are peripheral prophets. These are prophets who sit on the edge. They're more so even the more living into some kind of liminal activity or liminal role, because they're technically the prophets who are not trained to be prophets. They do not make their money from this. They're kind of called out of the middle of nowhere, and they operate almost as I would say leaderless prophets. They don't have any type of prophetic mentor, and they're just out there operating, and God calls them to do so. And Amos is one of those prophets. Amos is actually, if you read the book of Amos, and it's a great book to read, so please do read it, it's great. Or you can take the Introduction to Prophets class that I'm teaching at the end of the month, and we're definitely reading the book of Amos because it's amazing, and it's very relevant to this time. MLK used Amos in his speeches about issues that we're still dealing with today. So Amos is a great book. Nonetheless, Amos is the shepherd. He is this herder of animals, and he is called from the fields, from his place in Judah, the southern kingdom, and he is called to deliver a message to the northern kingdom. So he actually has to leave his home to go to a place that he does not live and live into a role that he does not normally live into. So he is certainly a peripheral prophet. We also get Ezekiel as someone who is a peripheral prophet. The only difference between Amos and Ezekiel in so many ways, if we want to think about their previous roles, is Ezekiel was kind of trained to be a priest. So he is very much trained and has always had a relation to like the things related to the religious cults of the people. Nonetheless, Ezekiel is taken from his land, which is in the southern kingdom. He is taken to Babylon, so a completely foreign land. And it's in Babylon during the year in which he is meant to emerge as this educated and responsible priest, that instead he emerges as a prophet. And he does these weird behind gestures that are amazing in order to deliver a prophetic word to the people about their current condition and about the fate of the place he was exiled from. So he's really directing a lot of his words to the people who are stuck in the land, and thinking through why this is happening, why exile is happening, and what the exiles, the people who are living among him, should be doing in this time. Then we have institutional prophets. So these are your occupational prophets, and these can be broken up into various groups based upon institution. So we get court prophets. These are prophets who did a lot of their activity tied to political individuals. So the court of the king was a heavy location for prophetic words. Also, the city gates, where the king would have his heralds make announcements to the people. The agora in the Greek, the marketplace. So court prophets are very much prophets who kind of earn in so many ways, not just their prestige and some kind of authority that's tied to their name, but they're also kind of taken care of by their role that is heavily connected to a political leader. These prophets often rise as wise men and counselors to kings. So we get Isaiah 38 and 2 Kings 19 really talks to us about various times in which Hezekiah was receiving certain words from Isaiah, and acting as, in so many ways, some kind of counselor or that's providing some kind of respite or answer or resolve to King Hezekiah. And then in Micaiah, we get this interesting narrative where you get some references to God placing lying spirits in the mouths of the prophets. But Micaiah is the one who acknowledges that. And he's a prophetic voice that the king does not want to hear from, because he's always speaking these prophecies that are adversive to the king. But he's a prophet called upon by the king to present a prophetic word in the court. And lastly, there are cult prophets. So in 1 Kings 18, this is a text that talks a lot about Elijah, Elisha. They're a company of prophets. So they're literally these prophetic companies that go around, they live together, they learn together, and they are just simply known by the people as some kind of company of people who perform prophetic activities. When certain kings are anointed, like Saul, for example, after he is anointed or after the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, he takes off his clothes and prophesies nude with the company of prophets. So it's a group of prophets who seem to be tied to some kind of group or company, some kind of religious group of people doing prophetic activities. And then there are also other types of cultic prophets who are tied to the temple. So they might make money by their close relations to the temple. And in that case, sometimes there's a blurring of the line between priests and prophets. So some priests are prophets, but not all. Questions here? Or comments, concerns? Okay. So I'm going to make you guys talk a little bit because I want you guys to add your voice. So I want to know, what have you heard or what have you learned about the office of prophet? Any takers? What are you taught about the role of prophets in churches?
I think often we hear that the prophet is just basically a messenger or someone that is in somehow bringing a message from God, or they heard from the Lord. And somehow the hearing from the Lord for me is a bit tricky because I don't think I've heard the audible voice of God yet. Maybe I have, but I haven't listened attentively. But yes, so I think that is kind of one of the things that is pretty much preached in churches, and then also some others then places a very great emphasis on modern day prophets. I would say, and they start giving labels to individuals that this is the prophet, this is the prophetess. But I sometimes also feel that that can be a little bit tricky. But that is just some of my personal feelings, I guess, because I don't think we should be about titles and that sort of things. Although I like Amos because what his message on justice, so that is quite
Yes.
nice for me. Well, that's more a comment than a question, I guess. But maybe you can add to that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So yeah, we commonly hear prophets as some messengers of God, Sometimes they're tied to hearing the audible voice of God, but prophets receive their words in all types of ways, just as we would in our relationship with God, receive God's word in a lot of ways. And just as we would receive various forms of communication from the people, the human people that we love, like looking at their facial expression tells us a whole lot about what's in their heads sometimes, or reading their work, or listening to their webinar, I don't know, or looking at other forms of their nonverbal communication. Um, it's the same way with God. So some people receive their words from God by looking at nature, by reading the Bible, by looking at people, by hearing people differently, by seeing dreams and visions, and by inclination. Sometimes you just know things. And knowing is certainly a sense. It's a sense. It's one of the, it's not one of the five senses, but we can add it as a sixth sense, and one that is really important, especially in this time. Um, I saw a few comments on Facebook. Toshiba, the name of the judge, her name is Deborah. Sometimes they pronounce her name Deborah. Both work, you know. And I want to say you can find her in Judges chapter 4, around there. And Miss Jillian said, South African context prophets are at times scary. It seems God speaks to them clearly, but in broad strokes. I am always concerned when someone calls themselves a prophet. Yeah, it scares me too, to be honest. It does, but it only scares me because, as what Cameron mentioned, is there's a tendency for us to um, use this term almost as a way that elevates the nature of one or more people above the nature of others. And so prophets, in so many ways, they live in this realm of fear, um, and they develop some kind of a power as a result of that fear to not only do good for people, but to do bad for people. The office of the prophet is one of the most abused offices in the body of Christ, and it's really because, you know, we're really allowing these titles to create stratification, which is actually allowing us to bring in some bit of difference and elevate certain people over others. And it's a problem, certainly a problem. Um, so a lot of people discuss the office of the prophet from the standpoint of Ephesians 4. Um, and it's really interesting that this is a heavy text that's employed, because the language is really ambiguous in so many ways. If you know the Greek, when it's describing the term that we translate some, it's actually using just a definite article, meaning the. So I'll present to you the text as it is written in the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and then I'll kind of give you an idea as to how it would sound if we actually translated the tous, which is the plural definite article that's used here in the text, as something else, because definite articles can be translated a whole lot of ways. And in some ways, it can be translated in ways that limit the noun, and in other ways, it can be translated in ways that present a more universalistic and some kind of a broad stroke or understanding of the term itself. So it's verse 11. The gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us have come into the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. But if we looked at this in the Greek and we translated that Greek definite article as just the, or sometimes it can be translated as on the one hand or on the other hand, or the former or the latter, or things of that nature, it will just look like or sound like this. The gifts he
We
gave.
have a quick question.
Sure.
Someone from the Facebook audience presented a question. Um, Tabisha Wright, I hope I'm pronounced to Toshiba Wright, I'm sorry, asked, will God continue to speak to someone who is abusing their gift of prophecy?
That's interesting. It's a good question, Sheba. Um, it's a great question. And this is how I'm going to answer it in a very confrontational way. The gift of prophecy is not just a gift or a potential that allows you to be sensitive to the voice of God, but sensitive to other voices too, or sensitive to other I don't want to call them forces or entities. Those are too limiting of phrases. Um, Other manifestations of the spirit as well. So, for example, there's a whole YouTube community that is heavily focused on presenting everything that Christians call new age. And whenever we hear that new age term, we all run and duck because we just tie it completely to witchcraft. But in truth, prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, it all fits in the same realm as the same in the spirit as the witch or the astrologer. It's all divination, every bit of it, um, which is fascinating to think about. So you can actually learn quite a bit from these people who identify as being a part of the New Age movement. But one of the things that they have is they have people who are angel mediums, who are speaking or speak prophesying using the words of angels. So you have all of these various ways that people were kind of, or and then you have this really weird part of it where some people are actually like divining for aliens, like otherworldly creatures. It gets really bad. Don't go down the rabbit hole. Nonetheless, um, there are lots of people partaking in prophetic activity that's not necessarily tied to God. And it doesn't take away from the fact that they're living into a prophetic office or a prophetic action. And so all prophets don't speak for God. So in this case, it is certainly still possible to perform and to live as some kind of prophetic voice and still be abusing your prophetic potential. On the other end of things, God looks at our hearts, and some people abuse the prophetic office with pure intentions. I know that sounds horrible, but sometimes it's the case. There's a huge gray area, and in so many ways, because prophets are liminal characters, they live in the gray because that's where God is. It's where God is speaking from. It's in the gray, and so yeah, it's hard to answer your question. Yeah, sometimes people who are abusing the office can certainly still be receiving prophetic words, can still be very much sensitive to the voices and the trauma that people are experiencing, can still have very active gifts. Gifts come without repentance.
And can I?
And
Oh,
they
when
could
you're
be
done, can I
volatile.
piggyback?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I was gonna say like, this is stuff that I think in the traditional church, um, especially when we talk about our modern day churches, this kind of talk can be very controversial because we
Hmm.
identify quote unquote the warrior prophet as someone who speaks on behalf of God or who is a messenger of God. But like when you really I think dig down into really just from a foundational standpoint, like a prophet, like you said, is a person that is connected to the spirit. A prophet is somebody who is um kind of on similar terms as a diviner, right? It's just
Yeah.
the way we kind of define the two, or the way we kind of separate the two is where are we who is the source of our I guess the source of the sustenance, the source of the power. Who do we look to for information, right? Is it God or is it somewhat of a what we call a familiar spirit or another spirit or a spirit that is not of God or a spirit that is not of Christ? And so we need to understand. So for as we dig through like what a prophet is and what a prophet is not, we need to understand these, right, kind of in a dynamic way. We need to understand these
Yeah.
concepts, in order to kind of really answer your question. So, and I guess to dive deeper, even if we're just talking about from a church standpoint, can God still use folks that abuse their gift? Well, the Bible tells us that gifts and callings, do come without repentance. And so, a lot of the times, like we look at a person's gifting and saying, oh, well, that person's gifting should dry up because their life isn't right, or that person's gifting should be null and void because they're abstinent of morality, and things of that nature, or they don't have any virtue. This person doesn't have any integrity. But the reality of it is that a gifting is a gifting, no matter what a person does or does not do. Um, and so that's why we really have to, we really got to be in prayer. We really have to seek the face of God. And we really have to ask God to give us the gift of discernment, so that we can know, as a person is speaking, where are they speaking from? Does this person have the intent of God, or does this person not have the intent of God? Um, and so yeah. So to answer it, I think on a very basic level, yeah, a person can definitely still be flowing and not be walking in the spirit of Christ, or not be presenting the fruits of the spirit.
Totally. Thank you for that, Cord. I totally agree. And while you were talking, there were things that were coming through my mind. One of the really, really hard things about communication is that words have a tendency to limit what we say, what we can mean. And then when those words are placed in an authoritative source like the Bible, then what ultimately happens is this very limiting point of view and this ability to interpret the text very narrowly. And it kind of hurts us in some kind of ways. So I think, and this is why learning biblical languages is really important. I think if we can think about how words are powerful in that they are very limiting, but they can also be expansive. The same word can have 5,000 meanings tied to it and things of that nature. Then we can start picking at the language of the text. So yes, we're taught that there is a gift of prophecy. Well, yeah, sure, but I think if we think more expansively and we're able to identify that the gift isn't necessarily a thing, but a person or a aspect, a potential, a part of our person, then it becomes even the more natural for us to understand that really, whether you have pure intentions or not, what is a part of you you naturally live into what is a part of you, especially when you're capable and you're knowledgeable of that power, you know and so yeah, it makes more sense in that case to think that people who might abuse their potential, their prophetic potential, would still operate because it's who they are. It's not just what they have, it's who they are. It's who you are, it's who we all are, because all humans are prophetic. We were all created with a prophetic heritage. And in so many ways, we all act as prophets in various veins and various arenas in our lives. So we all need to start to see ourselves as not possessing gifts, but being gifts, and somehow like living into our identity as gifts, not possessing them, but being them. I hope I'm saying that in ways that make sense. My mind is kind of
Yeah,
full of
yeah. I,
stuff.
I was gonna say, I think it makes a whole lot of sense. Even when we look at today's society, all of us are not, we're not prophets in the traditional sense.
Hmm.
In some form of fashion, each of us has the ability or the capacity or the potential to kind of live um into into a prophetic office, I guess, or an inclination. If we look at, what does it mean to be, a prophetic voice even in your workplace? What does it mean to be a prophetic voice in your household? Because we talked, I think we talked last month about, we kind of flushed out what a prophet is and what a prophet is not, and so even as
Yeah.
we figure those things out, like how do we live into the prophetic, in our spaces? Because a prophet is simply just somebody who is an intermediary, right? Or a person who comes to bring life or to speak life, right? Or, kind of that plumb line that we kind of talked about, right? The plumb line that keeps things in order and keeps things on track. So even getting out of the traditional sense, I guess, in the urban modern day church, what we feel and know what a prophet is, but a prophet really, in its purest sense, in its purest form, is just somebody who is able to kind of act, to kind of stand in the gap, the person who lives out intercession, who not doesn't just pray intercession, but lives into intercession, right? To
Mhm.
to live into kind of being in the middle of, what is this versus what is that. And so, like, I think that, as we flush these things out, we have more of a better understanding of what the prophetic is.
Yeah, you're living into intercession is really interesting, and I love how you said it. Not only because you use lived into. I know I pick at you about that sometimes,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna trademark it. But but also because when you're living into something, it's all about reconciliation in so many ways. Because prophets live in between multiple worlds, it is the job and the role of the prophet to reconcile those two worlds. And I think that part gets really left behind in so many ways, because people generally choose to live in one world, or to live more in one world than the other, or to present the idea that people can't live, or certain people don't have access to those worlds. And it is the role of the prophet in so many ways to help people understand that they do, and to help, kind of in so many ways bridge and bring those worlds together. But what you also said about, like, people's role as prophet in workplace and things of that nature, it gets us right back to this slide. If we identify the office of the prophet as being tied to institutions, that can really help us, because we see the Hebrew Bible prophets as being tied to political institutions, religious institutions. We just talked about that. Prophets in the court of the king, peripheral prophets as being having a religious but also a social role, cult prophets and things of that nature.
Mm.
But there's also the social arena, the social institution, like the home, the workplace, right? We're talking about family and things of that nature. There's a little typo there. Please disregard that. Nonetheless, the family, the household. Some people will, in that case, be the be or act as prophets in their own households, and that's where their prophetic activity is limited to. That's where their sphere is, and it is really truly the responsibility of parents to be that for their kids. It is the responsibility of teachers in so many ways to prophetically speak into the lives of their students. So then their prophetic activity might be restricted to their classrooms and things of that nature. So understanding your sphere of influence becomes really important here. And when we're talking about sphere of influence, we're really just talking about where prophetic activity occurs, and we're talking about the place of jurisdiction where you are authorized to prophesy. And that authorized term is in quotation marks because it's a conflicting term, right? Um, Nonetheless, we're talking about jurisdiction, and there are certain questions and things that we need to reflect on, ways in which we need to interrogate ourselves to make sure that we are understanding our own sphere of influence. And I was going to do a little small activity where I allow you guys to help me flesh out some of the questions that we should ask ourselves, but for the sake of time, because we do try to keep these webinars in an hour, I'll go ahead and mention them. So when you're thinking about your sphere of influence, it requires self-reflection. It requires contemplation. It requires consistent interrogation. It's not something that you do once a year or once in your lifetime. It's something you do every single day. And you want to ask yourself a few questions. First off, who am I sent to? Who am I sent to? You know? And then you want to ask yourself, like, what message am I carrying? Like, what do I need to say? And lastly, you want to ask yourself is, where and how do I present this message to the intended audience? So, for example, let's use a Bible prophet, Amos. Amos is called from the southern kingdom to leave his home to go to the northern kingdom and do prophetic activity there. What he is prophesying about is the injustice of the people. The people are treating other people like crap and are therefore um, breaking covenant, because covenant with God is tied to not only fidelity to the law, but it's tied to how you relate to people. And if you're not being just in your relation to people, there's a problem there. Amos identifies that problem, and he goes and he prophesies to the northern kingdom. Where does he go? He goes where people can hear him, where the people who are the recipients of his word can hear him. So he knows he's sent to the northern kingdom. It's the very first thing you see when Amos is called. He knows what he is meant to say, and he goes directly to the place or the places he needs to go to say it. He's a peripheral prophet, but it seems to be the case that he went to some kind of court or city gate, because in chapter 7, you get Amaziah, the priest, pretty much chewing Amos out and saying, you prophet, go back to where you came from. Go make your money in your own hometown, because Amos is causing a ruckus. He's prophesying exactly in the place that he needs to prophesy and to the people he needs to prophesy, and it's manifesting in some kind of form of adversary or whatnot. We have to think about these same types of questions, you know, as if you are a mother, like in that case, you might be sent to help your children come into being, help them understand their identity and live into that. Your kids are the people that you were sent to. The message that you might be carrying is one of identity, and one of and the basic and very important teachings that you need to pass on to your kids in order for them to effectively live into the world or live in the world, but also to effectively live into their identities, their God-given identities. You know, Proverbs is really important in this case, because Proverbs is all about passing on wisdom to your children. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs is all about the parent passing on important instruction to a son. And really, in this case, it's the son who is maturing. It's the son who is about to go out into the world and find a wife and find a job. And because of that, a lot of the instruction is stay away from this type of woman, gravitate to that kind of woman, right? Stay away from lighty folly, stay away from those fast women, and love wisdom, right? Be careful who you associate yourself with, right? Those are the messages that parents are directed to give to their children in the book of Proverbs. And in so many ways, the expectation is the same today. Yes, the book of Proverbs is amazing, and it is so instructional. And I love how almost none of the texts actually fit very well together. It's amazing. Like, you find something about ants, and then 2 verses later, we're talking about the importance of controlling your tongue or whatnot. It's great. But in that case, the parent, his intended audience, and the way that he or she is going to get that message to his intended audience is going to be related to the household. So the parent will know that his or her sphere of influence, where she does or he does his prophetic activity as it pertains to his children, is the household. You know, so asking yourself those questions, and then being open to your sphere of influence expanding as you know, effectively live into your identity and your current sphere of influence. Every so often, God will expand that, and you have to be open to that, which means you have to be willing to go back to the drawing board, examine yourself, interrogate yourself, continuing to contemplate and ask yourself these questions. And this isn't just for the role as or your role as prophet. It's also for your role as anything, really. Your role as pastor, your role as shepherd of the flock, all that fits into pastoring, your role as teacher, Um, so really thinking through the importance of knowing where you work and where your jurisdiction is becomes really important. Does do you have any
Can,
more
can I
comments?
can I maybe say so? I think
Yes.
in terms of the prophet, I think sometimes we need to be careful that that message that we're receiving is actually from God, number one. Number two, that message is perhaps not only for us as a prophet. I don't necessarily identify as a prophet, but that message may just be for me and not
Hmm.
actually for the greater audience. And we need to actually test that. What is that message going to be beneficial in some sense to the greater audience, or is it actually going to be detrimental to the greater Christian body? And I
Yeah.
think that's where perhaps those around us, or maybe coming back to the mentorship thing, that is where we can lean into others to actually speak to others and hear, is that word going to be beneficial for the greater community, or is that maybe just for ourselves? Because I think sometimes we can say something, oh no, I heard from the Lord that your wedding is going to be for free. God spoke to me clearly, but that may not actually be the case. I
Yeah.
know that is a very light-hearted one, but because there's cases where the flock is actually hurting after a message comes from the prophet. So I think that is for me something that is important, just to test that word uh, that we receive.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Professor Cam. That is so important that we are testing and that we're prayerful about what the message is and who is it for. But also, if we are meant to share that with others, then we need to understand that what we say, how we say it, and the venue we use to say it, and also who we say it does matter. um like you have to get all your W's together, your when, where, what, like you got to get all of that together, because if any of those are off, the word can instant a good word can be detrimental to someone else because you said it to the wrong person, or in the same, or in the wrong way, or in through the wrong medium. It could lose its potency that way. So I agree. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so I just want to let you guys know what's going on with ABI for the rest of the month. We just have two more webinars for this month, and we'll release a new webinar schedule soon for you guys. We are going to continue to offer free webinars, but we're also offering monetized courses that you guys should definitely take. So we're going to discuss that just briefly. We have a webinar on Monday on teachers, the need, the office, and best practices. We have two amazing professors who are going to teach that and lead that discussion. And then just 1 week from today, we'll have a webinar on apostleship, the church, and the marketplace that's going to be taught by Professor Cord, who is also teaching the ministry in the marketplace course that starts at the end of June. So if you want a sneak peek with that course, you should definitely come to that webinar. All of these webinars are free to join. Registering for the webinar allows you to join the Zoom session where you can add your voice in real time. It also gets you a discount code for classes if you'd like to register for classes. And what we're offering at the end of the month is, it's just 6 courses, but really great courses. Two of these courses are 8-week courses. I'm teaching an Introduction to Hebrew Bible Prophets course, where we're going to talk a lot more about prophets, but we're talking about them from the standpoint of the Bible. So we're actually going to read prophetic text in that course. I'm going to take you through some basic things that you need to know. From the Hebrew Bible, earlier portions of the Hebrew Bible, like the book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history, that is essential for you to understand the messages and the movement of Hebrew Bible prophets. They don't just come out of nowhere. They're living into certain teachings and practices. And I need to share that with you before we actually read the prophetic books. And Onika Stewart is going to be teaching Introduction to the New Testament, Gospels, and Acts. Also an 8-week course. She's an excellent teacher, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot in that course. Then we're offering 4-week courses. One, Bible language tools, online resources. I am teaching that course, and it's all about how to study your Bible effectively using free online tools. It is not a language course, but we will learn how to play with the Hebrew and Greek using these free tools. So you'll learn how to do word studies, and then you'll learn how to use that to do things like contextual analysis and theological reflections and things of that nature. Onika Stewart is teaching Nurturing the Prophetic Imagination. Cordero Brown is teaching Marketplace Ministry, and Miss El Michelle Savant is teaching the social course, which is all about bringing yourself to media in order to expand your ministry or business. So please go to our website if interested. Also, if you're interested in that discount code, just send us the email and go ahead and register for classes. These classes are available to be taken really at a time that works for you. So all enrollees will receive an email that allows them to tell us what their availability is, and we determine the time of the course using the availability of the instructor and of the students. So it's going to be made available at a time that works for you, and it's going to be very much in a venue like we are here on Zoom, so you'll be able to see the faces of your fellow peers and your instructor and ask questions in real time. And that's it. I hope you guys have a great Saturday.